Truth and reconciliation, that's been an ongoing issue. But I believe it is an ongoing process to establish and maintain relationships with Canada and the Indigenous people. And regarding residential school and past, not only just to acknowledge, but to move forward with a good relationship with a government, with Canada. I always think when you tell the truth, if you've done something wrong, you tell the truth, and the truth sets you free. They can no longer go after you or anything. You just admit it, something that was done wrong, you have done wrong, and your person that you're saying that to, like telling them the truth, how else can they fight you? But they can also, now we can establish a relationship with each other, an ongoing process that wouldn't end for our future generation.
That's a very tough question. That's a very big question to ask. In just sort of the general sense of it, I would say truth and reconciliation is acknowledging the process that Senator Sinclair and his team put together with the calls to action, truth and reconciliation call to action. That could mean a lot of big things, different things, and change in the way that we view and respond to residential school systems and colonization. I don't have a clear, definitive answer for that, but in my view, that I would like to see an acknowledgement to those calls to action. My mother, my grandmother, I call her my mother, she raised me. Also my biological mother went to residential school, and my father. My grandmother's experience with that has never been, she's never expressed it. We don't know. She took it with her to her grave. I don't know what it is. We never talked about it much. We didn't ask her. She assured us that she never had a bad experience with that system and what her experience is with residential schools. But I'm still not settled by that because I don't feel that that's truth. So I don't know what her experience was with that, but I don't feel there's been any sort of truth or justice to any of that yet. So to me, truth and reconciliation would first be to acknowledge those calls to action. What I like to tell people is we should all, first of all, learn and understand what those residential school systems did and what they've done and what they, like everything from the horrible experiences to, you know, whether you're thinking about your mom, your dad, your grandmother, your grandfather, uncle, cousin, somebody's making good choices to make those changes. So in a very blunt statement, you can say to somebody, well, if I took your kid from you and your home and I brought them with me, I didn't let you see them, I took them, I taught them my language, I taught them my culture. Maybe, you know, heaven forbid there was any sort of abuse beside that. That's traumatic enough as it is. That's traumatic enough as it is. I take you and I took your kid. How long is it going to take your kid to recover from that trauma? So, and I think about it today, and that's what I tell the youth. There are so many good people who are making those steps. Whether it's your mom, dad, grandfather. I get emotional about it, my grandmother. And that's what I like to talk about. I carry what my mom took with her. I don't know the stories. I wish I did, but I don't. My grandmother did a good job, I think, with her family and her kids and community. The example she led, no drugs, no alcohol, worked hard every day. So I want to better that, further that. So that's my experience with it. So.
Having been part of the residential school system and knowing that its impacts and how it affect our people, Indigenous people in general, and all the ones that have been involved with the residential school. Being 12 years old that I left my community, the impact or the cultural shock or the cultural differences that growing up as a young man or as a boy, actually, as a boy, and and then trying to live in a white man's world is it put an impact in my life, made an impact in a lot of people's lives. It was we had to follow certain rules, and as do I guess at home, but I mean more in general, being a part of a residential school. We have to set your mind to what you're there for. When you go to school, you have to go to school. Many years of my life I spent in the world, that kind of thing, in the abusing alcohol, and not knowing that the greatest impact, I guess, is losing my father at an early age, and the years I missed with him in Tagibo. I missed with him 4 years of my life, my youngest life, by the time that I should have been helping him with what he was trying to do with our lives. I think she was dead, and I missed her. But to go forward, knowing that this happened, it won't happen anymore, being reconciled to what we were, what we are as people, and as a community. There's some things I've withholden, and I've forgiven because I believe that I'm a Christian, and I have, as you know, Christ forgave us, and that's what I felt in my life when I became a Christian. I began to heal of the things that I went through. So that's how I got my healing. That's who delivered me from the lifestyle of alcohol.
Hello everyone, my name is Jimmy Thunder. I'm the Director of Economic Development for Norway House Cree Nation, and today we wanted to put together this video in honor of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation. So what is reconciliation? What does reconciliation mean? What is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? What are the 94 calls to action? It's really important for us to know the answers to these questions, especially for the youth, the members of the next generation, because it's the young people that are going to be carrying on the legacy of the commissioners of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. In this short presentation, what I want to do is to talk about the 4 stages of history as set about in the Royal Commission Report on Aboriginal Peoples. It's really important for us to know this history in order to understand everything that's written in this small book. So this is a book that is a summary of all of the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They gave us these 94 calls to action to tell us what we can do in order to advance reconciliation in Canada. However, if you were to sit down and read through these calls, there's a lot of concepts and ideas that is important for us to unpack. So we're going to start by looking at our history. As I mentioned, we're going to look at the 4 stages as set out by the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. The first stage of this 4-stage tier is pre-contact. There was at one point in our history where all of the European nations were separated by an ocean, and all of the indigenous nations were separated as well on Turtle Island. In each case, each side had distinct nations within their collective group, with distinct languages and distinct governance structures, both on the indigenous side and the non-indigenous side. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about pre-contact. And it's during this time that we have treaties that are made in and amongst one another. A lot of times historians like to think that history in Canada began at Confederation, but that's not the case. Our history as First Nations people goes on and on since time immemorial. So an example that I'd like to give is the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. So this is a treaty between First Nations within what is now known as Canada. At this time, they made this agreement with one another. The dish represents the lands and the resources. The spoon represents the fact that only one person could eat from the dish at one point in time. And this treaty basically said, hey, we're going to live together, we're going to share these lands and these resources. Also, in the dish with one spoon treaty, there is no knife. It's kept far from the table. So this is an example of a governance system and a treaty-making system and a legally binding agreement system that has caused peace and friendship between Indigenous nations. So as we fast forward to the next stage, the second stage is contact or nation-to-nation relationships. And it's during this time that we see treaties such as the Two-Row Wampum. The Two-Row Wampum Treaty was made between the Haudenosaunee and the Dutch. And it's an example of treaties that were made between Indigenous and non-Indigenous nations. The two rows in the treaty represent two rivers, or two boats, or two nations, moving in parallel to each other for as long as the sun shines, grass grows, and rivers flow, without harming each other. It was the agreement to share the land, to share the resources, and to respect each other as separate nations. This is a framework that's been used for treaty making since that time. So as we continue with the contact phase, other treaties start to take place. And so we see things like the Silver Covenant Chain of Friendship, which took place between the early 1700s and in the decades and centuries to follow. And this treaty actually symbolizes three different things. It's peace, good mind, and friendship. And it's made out of silver, because silver is something that needs to go back and to be polished, in the same way that these agreements need to go back and visited regularly. So next, I want to talk about the Royal Proclamation. So you'll notice in the Truth and Reconciliation book that it talks about the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So what was that? So that was a time after the 7 Years' War where King George, in the right of England, says, at this point, I want to be the sole person who makes any type of agreements with the First Nations living in North America. He wanted to be the sole person that does it. What it also did is it set out a framework for all treaty making from that time on and forever. So what I'm about to show you is a clip that was delivered by then Justice Murray Sinclair on his love-hate relationship with the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So he loves it because what it does is it recognizes Aboriginal rights. It recognizes that there is a need to have some kind of a framework for lands and for agreements with nations. Why he hates it is because it presupposes that the king has the right to make the decision in terms of who should or should not enter into these agreements. And it sort of eliminates the agency of First Nations to decide this for themselves. So Justice Murray Sinclair will explain this concept a little bit more.
And the Royal Proclamation was a recognition that Aboriginal people, Indian nations, First Nations as we now call them, were not to be trifled with, that they were to be respected, and that their rights to their territory and their right to take care of themselves within their own territory was not to be interfered with. And the declaration by the Crown at the time was that nobody, no colonial entity, no private individual, nobody could interfere with the Indian nations within their territories. But why I came to hate the Royal Proclamation was that it defended us against nothing, that it was not in fact a shield, and it was in fact used by the governments of this country and the United States and England since then as a vehicle, as a means by which they could interfere with First Nations, with their territorial rights. Because if you think about what the Royal Proclamation was, it was in fact an assumption of sovereignty over Indian territory by the Crown. The Royal Proclamation in and of itself is a declaration by the King of England that I am now the one that they must deal with for their territory. I am now the one who will be their protector. I am now the one who is the only one that they can deal with. So it was, in effect, a very arrogant, self-centered, selfish assumption of power on the part of the sovereign of England. So that's why I hate it. But that's also why it's important. It's important because of the recognition it gives, but it's also important because of the recognition it has taken away.
The next thing I want to chat about is the Treaty of Niagara. This Treaty of Niagara took place just a year later in 1764. And what it did is it recognizes that there is a need to take this royal proclamation and to have it, to make binding agreements with the First Nations all across Turtle Island. And so there were First Nations representatives from all across the lands of Turtle Island, also known as North America, and a treaty was entered into at Niagara. And so what you'll notice about this treaty is that it has the numbers 1764. So you're seeing the integration of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of knowing and Indigenous and non-Indigenous legal systems integrating into the treaty. And so that was the Treaty of Niagara. So if you look at Truth and Reconciliation Commission number 45, we call upon the Government of Canada on behalf of all Canadians to jointly develop with Aboriginal peoples a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation to be issued by the Crown. The proclamation would be built on the Royal Proclamation of 1763 and the Treaty of Niagara of 1764 and reaffirm the nation-to-nation relationship between Aboriginal peoples and the Crown. The proclamation would include, but not be limited to, the following commitments. And then it goes on to list a number of commitments. So you notice it says it's a Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation. So it's something binding, it's something huge that it's meant to go on for generations and generations to follow. It's built on this recognition of the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which most of us don't actually know or remember, especially non-Indigenous Canadians. It's also built on the Treaty of Niagara. Most importantly, it's the nation-to-nation relationship. It's recognizing that First Nations have a nation-to-nation relationship, and this Royal Proclamation of Reconciliation will set a new way forward, not just for the next decade, but for centuries and centuries to come. As a result of the Royal Proclamation, it laid out the framework for future treaties. And so that's where we see things like the Peace and Friendship Treaties on the East Coast, the Robinson Treaties, the Douglas Treaties. These are known as the Pre-Confederation Treaties. So the third stage that RCAP gives us is assimilation. So it's during this stage that respect gives way to domination, as they put it. The fur trade is dying off. This new country of Canada, which came into existence at Confederation in 1867, it's moving away from this fur trade, this cooperative way of building our economy, to this more dominant recognition that what really drives the economy of this new nation that's stationed here is the lands and the resources. And so First Nations were no longer seen as partners, but as a problem. And so it shifted to this policy of colonialism and this policy of assimilation. What's interesting to note at this time is that Canada was just initially 4 different colonies that confederated together. Different colonies had to join later on. And so what we see is that a very similar negotiation process of these colonies joining Canada as the treaty-making process. The difference is that when you look at a Canadian map today, you can see where all the different provinces are. You can see the results of these negotiating into confederation. What you don't see is all the different numbered treaties. In fact, people don't even recognize that the treaties still exist. So if you look at the numbered treaty map, most people don't know what numbered treaty they live on. This is why land acknowledgements are so important, because we're going back to recognizing the sacredness of these agreements. So while Canada was negotiating these numbered treaties, they also had unilaterally released the Indian Act in 1876. So think about that. Just 5 years after the first numbered treaty was negotiated, they unilaterally introduced the Indian Act, which controlled every aspect of First Nations' way of living. Some of these draconian policies included the pass system, where in order to leave the reserve, we needed a pass, or the permit system, where in order to buy or sell, we needed permission from the Indian agent. The peasant farming system, which precluded us from using labor-saving technology when farming. Most importantly, the Indian residential school system. It was during this policy that children were forcibly taken away from their homes through the enforcement of Canadian legal system into these schools that were meant to kill the Indian in the child, as was quoted by Duncan Campbell Scott. The purpose of this, from a colonial perspective, was to eliminate Indigenous nationality and all Indigenous distinctions. Because if you can eliminate those, you eliminate the treaty rights and you eliminate any recognitions of separate entities that Canada has to negotiate with or consult with when using lands and resources within the Canadian geographic area. To understand this a little bit more and to understand the significance of why we wear orange shirts, I'm going to share a video that was created by Phyllis Webstad on her experience with residential schools and why we wear orange shirts today.
Wade Wahwadip, Phyllis Webstad, Rensquest, Strachum Chatstam Stlakun. I'm speaking to you today from Shawetmach Ulach, the land of the Shuswap people in Williams Lake, BC. I'm a third-generation Indian residential school survivor. My grandmother attended for 10 years from 1925 to 1935. All of Granny's 10 children, including my mother, attended for 10 years from 1954 to 1964. I attended residential school in 1973-74. We all attended the St. Joseph Mission Indian Residential School, simply called the Mission, located just minutes from Williams Lake. My son also attended the last operating residential school in Canada when it closed in Saskatchewan in 1996. To tell my story, I was living with my granny as a child, and when I turned 6 in July of 1973, Granny took me to town to buy me something new to wear for my first day of residential school. I chose a shiny new shirt. It was bright and exciting, just how I felt to be going to school for the first time. When I arrived at the mission, my shiny new shirt was taken away. No matter how much I cried and wanted it back, no one would listen. I never wore my shirt again. Thoughts of home and Granny's garden, fishing for salmon on the Fraser River, are all memories that helped me through that year at residential school. Although the mission remained open until 1981, I never returned. I was able to attend a one-room schoolhouse just minutes from Granny's house in Dog Creek. The memories of that orange shirt being taken away and the lack of caring by those who controlled us kept me from wearing orange for a long time in my life, as the sight of orange would trigger memories of my experiences and the effects of my life from attendance at that school. I told my orange shirt story for the first time in April 2013, when preparation for when the Truth and Reconciliation Commission came to Williams Lake. Those involved with the event decided to honor the orange shirt as a symbol of the effects of residential schools and the need for every child matters. Originally, Orange Shirt Day was focused on the Caribou-Chilcotin region, but thanks to social media, it continues to grow and have a life of its own, and has grown into what it is today. My orange shirt story is not unique. There were 150,000 children that attended the residential schools across Canada, and they, or their families, all have a story to tell of that experience. And now, with the recent news of the confirmation of the 215 children announced at the Kamloops de Shawetmach on May 27, 2021, another experience from those schools is brought forward. I, like many Canadians, have felt the emotional impact of those findings. But for the survivors, we have always known about the children who died in those schools. This is why I say confirmation instead of discovery. Even so, when I first heard, I felt like I had lost a family member, and that's how much grief I felt. There are many more residential school sites to be searched, and the number of missing children and unmarked burials will continue to rise. I'm still grappling for a way to make sense of it all and wondering how we are going to get through this. My thoughts and prayers go out to the families, to everyone across Canada experiencing this unimaginable emotional pain. The missing children have awakened all of us to the reality of the history of this country. This year marks the first year of a National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, and National federal statutory holiday on September 30th. A day for thoughts and discussions on remembering, recovering, and reconciling. Orange Shirt Day is a day to have conversation about all aspects of residential school. It is a day to honor residential school survivors and their families, and to remember those that didn't make it. And a day to highlight progress in the reconciliation of Indigenous people and Canadian society. These actions are necessary to bring about healing for the future relationship in Canada. We chose September 30th because September is the time of year the children were taken away from their homes and their families. We chose the 30th because we wanted teachers and students time to settle in, time for teachers to teach students about the history, and time for us to plan an event. When I heard an elder say that September was Crying Month, I knew that we had selected the right date. The Orange Shirt Society has produced a number of videos available on our website for the purpose of teaching the past history and bringing understanding of the Canadian residential school system and its effects on Indigenous peoples. We encourage all to learn more of this subject. In closing, I want to thank everyone for participating in Orange Shirt Day and wearing an orange shirt. When you wear an orange shirt, it's like a little bit of justice for us survivors in our lifetime, and recognition of a system we can never allow again. I want to end with a prayer I wrote in my Secwepemc language. Kia el chba'a, de geld gukbi, gukstach guch pin de sietk, gukstach guch de juchinuch, gukstach guch de stietlen, el de saulqua, el de soup, el de graselksten, gukstach guch chuchweidap, jucheminta ra chuchweid de galmuch de chwaset. Guksjam, thank you for caring about what happened to us, and thank you for participating in Orange Shirt Day, the first national day for truth and reconciliation in Canada. Guksjam.
A part I see in reconciliation today is when I see people in Canada, non-Aboriginal, wearing our orange shirts at their workplaces, in daycares, all across Canada. I see that as reconciliation, a start of reconciliation. You are telling me as an Aboriginal Indigenous person that I believe you and I acknowledge it. And that's a move forward in reconciliation. Thank you.
So you can start to see the pattern of these 94 calls to action. The residential schools were meant to destroy our languages. So we have a piece on language and culture. It was meant to destroy our identity and so on. And so these 94 calls to action are meant to undo not only the redress of residential schools, but all of our colonial history, and to take the first 94 steps into rebuilding this relationship. So in 1990, the first time the Canadian public has heard about the horror of residential schools was when Phil Fontaine in 1990 made a statement on behalf of the Assembly First Nations. Then he was the national chief of the AFN, and his statement began to garner support for the residential school survivors that lived across Canada. A class action lawsuit was formed as a result of these efforts. Also in 1990, we saw the emergence of a crisis in Oka. The city of Oka wanted to build a golf course in Mohawk burial grounds. So rather than respect the sacredness of the burial grounds, the city of Oka decided to proceed. The Mohawks used every opportunity that they could to challenge it in courts, but it was not successful. So they ended up building a barricade, and Indigenous nations from across North America came to their support. The conflict escalated to the point that the Canadian military was brought in. And all across Canada and internationally, Canadian tanks were seen, and the Canadian military were seen fighting against the Indigenous nations living on living within the Canadian geographic area. It was a terrible crisis. When it was all said and done, the Canadian government began to ask the question, why is the situation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples so bad? So they started the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. This was the largest commission in Canadian history. And what they did is they explored our entire history from pre-contact to contact. They put together a final summary of their report, and they put together a 20-year plan in terms of how to improve the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples. However, unfortunately, despite their exhaustive report and their 20-year plan, largely the recommendations just sat on the shelf and nothing happened. So fast forward until 2006, the result of the work of the residential school survivors and their class action lawsuit was a success. They took Canada to court and they won. The settlement included 4 points. The first was that there needed to be an apology from Canada for the Indian residential school system. The second was that there needs to be a formation of a commission that would gather throughout Canada, collecting the stories, giving us a path toward reconciliation. And that was the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, based off the model that was used in South Africa. The third was that there needs to be a place to store all of the stories and all of the research after the work of the commission is done. And that led us to the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. And the fourth piece of the settlement was compensation for all the survivors. So in 2008, the apology took place, and here's how it sounded.
I stand before you in this chamber so vital, so central to our existence as a country, to apologize to Aboriginal peoples for the role the Government of Canada played in the Indian residential schools system. To the approximately 80,000 living former students and all family members and communities, the Government of Canada now recognizes that it was wrong to forcibly remove children from their homes, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that it was wrong to separate children from rich and vibrant cultures and traditions, that it created a void in many lives and communities, and we apologize for having done this. We now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermine the ability of many to adequately parent their own children and sow the seeds for generations to follow. And we apologize for having done this.
Afterwards, the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission took place, and they went all across Canada collecting stories from survivors, and they put together their final report. It was a 6-volume report that, if you stacked on top of each other, would probably be this high. And then they created an executive summary, and then beyond that, they created these 94 calls to action. And it was strategic. We look back at what happened with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples. In this case, we have these 94 calls that summarizes all this work and all of this research, and it gives us the first steps in terms of how we can make a difference using reconciliation.
We know that among you are the future leaders of this country. Among you are those who are going to govern this land. Among you are those who are going to make important decisions about reconciliation. And you are going to have to come to terms with this history that you're going to hear a little bit about. And we know that's a difficult process, but it all starts with 3 things. You must watch, you must listen, and you must show respect.
It's finally nice that we realize everything and we learn about it, what really happened.
My grandparents, my mom, been through this residential stuff, so I just really wanted to know more about it.
I've learned a lot, actually, considering that my grandma didn't tell me very much or anything. So I've learned what abuse they had to go through. I've learned when it started, how long it was for, when it ended. I've learned a lot.
I want to learn about what happened to my dad when he was in residential school, and want to learn the healing process and what will help with it.
It makes me feel kind of sad, for those kids, because they were it was torture. It's not fair. They just took them away from their homes, so they just go to that school. I just didn't agree with that. It's just really wrong.
It makes me upset when I think about it, because just knowing what like my dad and his mom had to go through, it's really hard like to deal with, I guess. I don't know. It bothers me a lot, and now I realize like why my dad drank so much when I was a little kid, I guess.
It'll kind of change the way I think about things, like how it would like affect someone's life and their kid's life for like generations. That's one of the worst things that Canada did.
I hope events like this just are able to bring closure to a lot of horrible things that happened, and I hope a lot of people now recognize that crime happened and that we need to make amends for it.
I'll never forget this day because today is the first day they ever told us about residential schools, and if I ever see anyone that's Aboriginal, I'll ask them if they can speak their language, because I think speaking their language is a pretty cool thing.
I like being around this. I like hearing the drums and seeing everybody else and learning about new nations and all these new languages I have not heard of yet.
I think we should start a dance crew and start bringing back our culture, start speaking our language, and everyone should just treat each other equal.
Our traditions carried on and passed down so that all our younger generations, and so that my baby knows what happened in the past to her ancestors, and so that she can just keep bringing our tradition forward and passing it on to her kids and their kids and everything.
And I hope that something like this never happens again anywhere in the world, and the importance of letting people know is so that it doesn't happen again, and it's good for the younger generation to know that, so that we all treat each other as equal.
Thank you everybody for watching. I want to encourage everybody to really engage in these 94 calls to action, to look at what it means to decolonize. To decolonize simply means to take ideas that were colonial, that should never have existed in the first place, and just remove them from ourselves. So we have an opportunity to be voices, especially I want to speak to the young people. You have the opportunity to use your life to really make a difference, both for your community, for your family, and for society. So this is what Orange Shirt Day is all about, what the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation is all about. It's about looking at our history, it's about telling our stories, and it's about making sure that as we remember, we make sure that none of the terrible history happens ever again, and that we can move forward into a better future. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video useful, please share it with your loved ones today. And if you are in need of support, please contact the people who have expressed their willingness and availability to be that support at this time. Thank you so much. That goes it.